How to Survive a Sword Fight. Keep It Tight by none other than Skallagrim.
Here's something to consider about historical martial arts and perhaps film choreography too. You may want to keep the movements tight and efficient. I've talked at length about how fantasy sword fighting often lacks the subtlety you find in real martial arts.
I love, is that a game? I love this. This aesthetic goes really hard, Skallagrim.
Below if you haven't seen that video. But of course, video games are a special case because the animations need to be clear enough. People need to see what's going on. And you need to be able to navigate all that through the peripheral delay of using a controller.
Well, yes, and I would argue things like anime as well can greatly exaggerate certain movements, right? If we, one of the combat critiques up on this channel, right, where we take a look at Lancer and Saber from Fate Stay Night, and a lot of these movements are grandiose. There's very wide arcs, you know, leave them wide open. This is to differ than, say, in SCA this week alone, right? I ended up doing a thing with Rapier where I had in my opponent, think of it like I'm facing my opponent straight up with the blade, and my nails are like my actual fingernails, they're pointing to the left, right? And my blade is vertical. All I did was rotate my wrist into the fourth position in Rapier, where my nails are now up, right? My hand is up, and my blade is now horizontal. And in just doing that action alone, it actually expelled my opponent's blade way off to the left side of me. All it took was just me to rotate the direction of my blade to cause their line of attack to just drastically change. And that makes a huge difference. All the difference in the world, realistically, right? And it wasn't from some grandiose movement. However, that doesn't necessarily translate outside of certain things. And absolutely, you could have a video game cutscene or an anime scene, right, where it zooms in on a character or maybe their internal monologue, and then it snaps to their hands, and you see them turn the blade turn like the hilt in their hand to turn the blade's direction, and then you could have something expel like that. But generally, for a media audience, you know, your generalized media audience, you're going to have these larger, grandiose swings. It's going to be flashy. That's why you have things why you have, you know, stage combat versus what I do, which is more just, you know, a glorified game of tag, if you will. And it's different in itself from real combat, but there are absolutely differences from somebody who's taken a couple classes on stage combat. There are a lot of differences, and that you can choreograph a lot more to a degree. With what I do, it's very much by the seat of your pants. You see what your opponent's doing. You're able to see that they're moving. You're able to see where a thrust is coming from, where a strike is going to come from. You're going to see them cavazione, and it is your job to respond, or alternatively, it is your job to be the aggressor, to take the offensive, to engage with the opponent. And that really is closing the measures about 90% of what I do. And it's fun. I will give it that. It makes me feel alive.
We often see exaggerated telegraphed movements with a lot of overswing. That would get real historical swordsmen into a lot of trouble.
It would. And so here's the thing from SCA alone, right? Let's go look at that arc again. And Skallagrim does a great job at showcasing this, right?
The peripheral delay of using a controller. So you often see
if I'm using in Rapier, right? And you're going to do an overhead swing like this, they're just going to close the gap. They're going to lean on in, and he's just going to go for the stab. Oh, well, Kip, this is clearly a longsword. I will give you that point. I will give you that I am one of the only people that I know that will bring a longsword into Rapier format. Let's go with something like heavy, something like cut and thrust, something, you know, with armor, right? Maybe they got like a pole arm or something like that. If they see you telegraph this, they're just going to passing step in and just knock right into you. There is the tempo at what you're going, and tempo relating to music, right? Tempo, the amount of time it takes to do something. The tempo for him to do this, to wind up and to strike, is longer than the tempo it's going to take for someone to just passing step on in who's keeping it tight.
Exaggerated telegraphed movements with a lot of overswing, that would get real historical swordsmen into a lot of trouble. Losing limbs kind of trouble. Depending on the weapon. In case of a large two-handed sword, which has a lot more reach and mass, keeping the momentum going is important. So
that's actually how claymores, I hear, are used. You keep that momentum going. You just become this steel fan, so to speak, where you keep it moving and keep your circles going. That's why I have a claymore.
In that case, you may see more large circular movements as opposed to tight movements. However, with a lighter...
That does come down to the weight and size of it, though. I will say that comes down to the weight and size of it, and why in Dark Souls, right, we can have this Zweihander, and we can use it like a sword. But generally, as far as I'm aware, historically, we have used Zweihanders more akin to pole arms.
Long sword or single-handed sword, like a side sword or a lot of rapiers or a saber, perhaps it's a different story. Now, personally, I've learned cutting with fairly large movements for a number of reasons. For one, it makes it easier to cut the tummy mats.
Right.
And two, also the way I learned to drill techniques in flow drills where you go say, false edge cut, true edge cut, false edge.
Yeah, these are just ribbon cuts, right? Those that play SCA, HEMA, etc. are ribbon cuts, right? Think about that.
True edge, this kind of thing that encourages larger circular movement that you keep going, which again is perfectly good for, say, a greatsword. Now, if in sparring with a fairly light sword, you use such large movement patterns and the opponent uses tight patterns, you're in trouble. No lost limbs in sparring, obviously, but it might get frustrating. So
and that's where it is a glorified game of tag, right? You're not at risk of losing a limb. You're not at risk of losing your head. You're not necessarily at risk from, and I say necessarily, there was a incident, not necessarily an incident. My buddy, him and I were doing some rapier, and he got through my, so how you have the fencing mask, he got underneath this, over the gorget, and over my padding I think I was wearing my plate mail at the time, actually. I think I was wearing my plate. He got through 3 layers of defense, and his blade ended up in my, at my throat. And I just kind of look at him and go, how, what, really? Because that stuff always happens to me. And obviously I was fine, right? My voice is fine. Like, he had enough understanding and control to pull that. But you can be as safe as you want. Sometimes that blade and that point just has your name on it, and you're not necessarily at danger of losing that. I mean, obviously, even taking precautions, things can happen. Ultimately, it is a sport. Ultimately, it is something that you engage in can be dangerous at certain points. And just be cognizant, understanding. That's why I don't necessarily, spar with anybody. Why I don't necessarily do that with everybody. I have to be like, okay, you're not just going to actually swing this like a baseball bat and, cause a problem, right? And I think that's completely fair. I like doing this. I want to share this with people, but also please don't be stupid when you do this. But yeah, back in historical period context, right, where if you got a cut on your arm, your bicep, if you got a cut on your throat, if you got a cut to the abdomen or groin, right, not only are you going to be in danger of bleeding out, but also the subsequent infection as well, where if you may not be unalived on the field, in the dueling field, right, but you got to deal with medicine not being what it is nowadays. You have to deal with severe infection, potentially fatal levels of infection, right? And ultimately a very painful and just awful way to go. So things to consider in historical context for how martial arts and certain sword forms did evolve.
I retrain myself to make the movements more compact. Now, it may not be a big deal to cut like this, right?
Depends on the situation.
Not hugely telegraphed.
No.
Right? It's just...
And heavy to be fine.
Good amount of follow through. It's powerful. But depending on the opponent, that may already be too much. Compare this to that. More power.
Right. So instead of using the whole weight, right, you are using the whole weight and you are generating a lot of force behind that. No one can really contest the amount of force.
Less exposure.
You're versus that, where you're starting from more of a closed position, and as you progress through it, you just have your... Sorry, YouTube's being weird. You kind of just have this plane of steel that just kind of cuts on in, right? And you're not necessarily using all of your arms. You're not using this wide arc. You're just kind of extending this to your endpoint, right?
You can and should still try to engage as much of the body as possible.
Yeah.
So instead of just swinging with the arms,
right,
you put your
you're in the
body weight into it and
middle of power.
Core, but there are plenty of ways to improve the attack and tighten the movement.
Yes.
Even something subtle as this versus that can make a difference, because here you're telegraphing a little bit.
Yeah.
Just by tilting the blade back, it's not much, but to an experienced opponent, that can be a tell. Whereas,
it could just be, say, if you're a German longsword practitioner, or if you're someone that just is 6 foot X and just absolutely stacked, right? People will call you fluffy, right? Versus someone like that, they can telegraph their attacks all they want to. How do you deal with that? How do you just go about it? What is your response? How do you respond to this? Because you have to respond to that. If he's got length on you, if he's got reach on you, if he's absolutely just built like a brick house, right? how are you going to respond to that? Generally, I mean, you might want to get distance, you might want to passing stuff off to the side, get his line of attack off of you and try to go in with your own, right? That kind of thing. There's a number of things you could do. What I'm trying to say is sometimes you can absolutely telegraph your attack. It's, do you think you can deal with this? And that's a little bit of a power play, because a lot of combat is just mental warfare. It really is, right? If you get inside your opponent's head or you catch him off guard, I mean, that's still valid, obviously, you know, within reason, right? Like, you can't necessarily call their mother a hamster and that they smell of elderberries and, you know, mean it in a very negative and mean context, right? But, you know, like, just training them to do something specifically, or maybe not giving your full strikes out and feinting a lot of them, and they're, oh, okay, you're going to be very reserved, and then suddenly you just have this burst of aggression and you take them off guard, that kind of thing, right? Where you are manipulating with their perception of you.
If you focus on just cutting forward without doing that anticipatory movement, more efficient.
Yeah.
So this versus that. The less you follow through, or the character, I'll get back to that in a moment, the less power you have, so less threatening the attack is, but the less you expose yourself. Because if you do a powerful swing and just overcommit a little bit, and the opponent evades,
that's a really tasty shoulder, right, for your opponent. If you overpower and you miss your swing, you're all the way down here. You're out here. That's a real tasty looking shoulder right there, right?
that, now you're pretty exposed. As opposed to shortening the movement even more and ending up here.
So the difference here, and I actually want to comment on this because certain people would be like, okay, yeah, no, I see this is a lot tighter. So this serves a few different purposes. One, yes, absolutely, it's right there. But two, your opponent also has to respond to this. If you're all the way out here, right? Assuming lower because my model's in the way. If you're all the way out here, right? If you're all the way just out here, your opponent doesn't have to worry about you coming back, especially if you're false edge, right? The one that is, like, so his true edge is the one that's down, his false edge one that's up. You see how that kind of works, right? I can't necessarily explain it other than I don't have the technological vernacular to explain it. But especially if it's false edge down here, or if he's overcommitted to a strike and suddenly his arm, his arm is in your face, right? Where this, you are maybe gonna have to worry about him, coming up, or maybe he can passing step this way, and then suddenly his line of attack is on you again, right? And it forces a response, right? But more than that, it also guards you to a degree, because what happens if for some reason, so you backstep and you come back in and you try to do a slash here, I mean, he could honestly just draw his guard in tight, make this as vertical, maybe a little bit diagonal, and he can come back in and block that, right? While he exits and, passing steps backwards, right? And thus clearing himself of that action, which then prompts him, he can come into measure again, right? You see that keeping it more compact helps not just with your opponent having to answer it, but also helps your follow-up as well. And you are still generally facing your opponent at this point in time. You are still, you passing step back. Say if we were the POV of the camera, right? Okay, you're a little bit off center, passing step. Oh, suddenly, you're able to, shift your angle over here, and then suddenly you're looking at us, right? And there's just a lot of movement that this can actually flow into very, very well. And I think just wanted to kind of sit there and kind of point some of this stuff out and get people's, brain juices kind of flowing.
Right? So much less power, but if they want to move in, the point is right there.
Yeah, right there. You can also step in. You can also
lunge
lunge
in
in.
Guard position. Now, you're also in a guard position if you follow all the way through. So I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying, depending on the opponent, it might be necessary to tighten the movement to not be exposed, because they might be waiting for that. They might want you to swing just a little bit further so they can just narrowly evade and immediately counter thrust,
right,
for example.
And so here's the thing. It's not just on your opponent. It's what they're using as well. Your opponent and you can be pretty equal skill level. And if you're using single point, right, single sword, and they're, say, using two point, right, they're using, double offensive. Let's just say they're using two similarly sized short swords, right? So they're dual wielding. And realistically, from what he's showing here, so say he comes in, right? you yes can maybe answer it with your offhand, and then that suddenly his sword, his one point, is tangled up with one of your other points. But then you can passing step on and you get him in the gut, right? Or you could answer it with both of them if you really wanted to, and you had some really cool tech to maybe disarm or expel it, like catch, dispel, and then move on in, right? You could do something like that. I think the tempo would personally be a little too large. Things like that. If you have, say, dagger, right? Your dagger catches this. You can windshield wiper it away, right? Then you can come in with your main hand. You could tangle it up with your main hand. Then you could proceed to just aggressively step forward, step into measure, and then you could, try and get him that way. Move to shield, right? Well, if you try this, what happens if you block it on the shield? What is his response? Is he going to have to, back? He's going to have to retreat from this engagement. What's he going to do to try and do that? And a lot of people try to your buckler, right? They'll try to bait it so you hit the buckler, but they try and get it to slide off. You can also try and counter that where you slide along the edge of the buckler and then you thrust on in. It is entirely dependent not on just the person you're fighting, but what they're using as well that is going to dictate what you're going to do.
They can just narrowly evade and immediately counter thrust.
Exactly.
For example, especially when cutting in succession and going from one guard to the other, it may be easy to introduce larger movements. Mm-hmm. For example, say I start in plow guard,
so that's
and I want to do a diagonal cut from the right side and then a diagonal downward cut from the left side. All right, I can do it either like this or like that.
Right.
Now, of course, this is going to be weaker than that. And this depends on the kind of fight. I'm talking unarmored duels here.
Right.
If the opponent is armored, even if it's just a gambeson, then this is probably not going to be enough. No. Even if you put your body weight into it and just try to cut as hard as possible, it's probably not going to be enough to get through the gambeson and do sufficient damage. No. But even then, it's possible to make it more efficient. Instead of this, it can be... You can probably hear by the sound that this is still plenty of power and velocity. So when cutting in the pattern I just mentioned, I find it useful to focus on not allowing the blade to leave my field of vision, right?
Some people will also refer to this as the window. I'm sure some aspects of this are going to go into there. I think this is boxing logic. I've never looked too deep into boxing personally, but I have heard this is logic inside of boxing, specifically in regards to in-fighters. So you have your window, right? So think from your shoulder to shoulder, down to your hip, hip to hip, up to shoulder, right? So this is your window, so to speak. You want to keep your movements within that window. Right. So if your opponent tries to cut from out here, right? So they're just doing just this wide left field swing. You keep it in here. You just move this. You effectively just rotate this sword because you have this pommel. Use that leverage, right? You would rotate that sword into a vertical position and then move it this way. So you just go bop, right? And you stop it and you're still inside of your window, right? And then if you, then you can probably rotate your blade. That way it expels the blade and then your line of attack is off you, and then you can move on and thrust steps forward. You could do something like that. Alternatively, if you're looking to strike, so say on the other side of this, right? If I was looking to strike and I wanted to keep inside my window, I could maybe go here, maybe try and meet their blade, cavazione on in, especially from a rapier, right? And then maybe try to thrust on in. But I'm keeping it tight. I'm keeping it in here. I am, as far as I'm aware in the boxing world, I'm infighting. Versus there are people that will fight outside of this window. They are outfighters, and you have to deal with them a little bit differently. They don't want to be in here. I think they try to bully you in here, but they want to fight everywhere else. And that I don't have the particulars on. If you do understand boxing or do study boxing or understand the concept of this, I would be very interested to hear it in the comment section, as I myself am not really educated on that subject. I think there's a third type of fighter as well, although I'm once again not familiar with that. Generally, the way people will teach it, Bellegarth, SCA, I'm sure HEMA as well, ACL, organizations like that, keep it tight, keep it in your window.
So that, as opposed to...
Yeah, and where you're out.
I can't see it anymore. It comes all...
Well, the struggle that comes from that,
as opposed to...
You're out there, okay? What stops your opponent from, maybe going into a higher guard here? So like 2, right? Rapier 2, right? Nails down, and just thrusting on in and trying to block your advance in, right? You're all the way out here, especially if we are playing glorified game of tag rules, right? You know, all you need to do is just get in there, and is your tempo being able to step in and thrust into him? Is that going to be a smaller increment of time than it's going to take from him all the way out here to try and hit you, right? And that's where some of the mind games come from.
Now I can't see it anymore. And it comes all the way around. Or say in case of an undercut, rather than going this far, you could simply go up to about here, so the point is still available. Right. Again, this is not to say that's the only viable way to attack. Plenty of manuscripts show retracted guards. It can be anything from here to even very retracted.
Yeah.
And from there, of course, you can launch powerful cuts. In a lot of cases, depending on the opponent, that's not a problem at all. You can absolutely follow through. And again, you're still on a guard. You're not like over here. You haven't started to turn away from the opponent, which characters often do in fantasy settings. But I find it a useful exercise to try to train you to keep the movement as tight as possible.
Right.
Even, knowing that it wouldn't be all that effective. But in a sword fight, it's more important not to get wounded than it is to wound. So if you land a cut that's too weak...
Goes back to period setting, as we just discussed in this video. If you get cut, it's going to suck. You might actually just, get got by the disease down the road.
It doesn't even get through the clothing, perhaps. As long as you don't expose yourself, that's okay. The tricky thing about that is how to score it in HEMA tournaments, which is why some, or maybe many, HEMA tournaments require a certain minimum amount of rotation. You can't just go like this and call.
And that's where so actually in Rapier, I mean, there is a thing called percussive as well. So for instance, if I'm using, not even just longsword, but if I'm using a Rapier and I were to wrap someone on the head with that, right? It'd be percussive, right? Because with Rapier, we want to make sure that it's a point on thrust, right? Or at the very least, if we are missing them, we get that draw cut, right, to proverbially slice, right? That kind of thing. That's why we call it draw cuts, right? And absolutely, this comes into play in SCA as well. Specifically, what I'm doing, which is SCA Rapier, right? Where it's not necessarily amount of pressure per se, because absolutely you could step on it and your point could just barely touch it. But if it touches his chest, right? I mean, absolutely, yeah, take the L, right? I mean, it's honor system, realistically, everyone really has been pretty good about this in SCA, where nope, my bad, nope, you got the win, right? And I'm a little more, how do I say this? Harsh with my calls, if that makes sense. I take too many that I shouldn't take, but I also come from the logic of just like, it should be clean enough that there should be no room for error. And, someone will just barely graze me, where I could argue percussive, or I could argue that, it didn't hit me. Like we're talking like it's swishing fabric, and it's just like, no, I'll just take the L, right? My guard wasn't good enough to stop that, and there could be contention and argument here, from a a martial or a rule standpoint, right? So it's not just in HEMA. I mean, yeah, you need to make sure that there's a certain amount of pressure, or you're doing things in a way that you're landing those blows, landing that hit, And generally, I just go in with. And I'm sure other people go in with, realistically, the goal is to make it such a clean call that it's never in question. But naturally, those that have sword fought or have fought, sometimes that gets a little strange. Sometimes after the blow lands, you just kind of have to sit there and go through, how did this actually get here? Who hit each other first, especially in the upper echelons of play?
Call it a valid hit. It needs to travel a little bit further. And in my opinion, that is indeed important to prevent a wiggle fest to just chase points.
Yeah.
But, in a real unarmored, again, sword fight, it's perfectly viable. And even if you don't want to spar or compete that way, it's still a useful exercise because it teaches you to be more efficient with your movements.
Yeah.
As opposed to doing a big old swing like that. Just practice.
I mean, if he was going to do that big old swing in SCA, right? I mean, someone at the very least could even just step back and take his arm, right? Thus, why he's stressing, keep it a little tight.
Every now and then to try to lead with the point and eliminate any kind of anticipatory movement and try to make it as tight as possible. And the as possible part in as tight as possible matters here. Because, for example, from this guard, if I just want to lightly raise the blade and then cut from there, like this, that is really weak. Now, it could be okay, but I find it more reasonable to do a
I mean, you could do that. I mean, generally the play would be to cavazione, right? So if you and your opponent have both your blades out here, you'll do a little dip, and then you'll try to make your offense, or you'll, I think it was Capoferro. Oh my god, that man. I think it was you cavazione, swing it around, and with the force of you swinging it, you hit back on the other side of their blade, you expel it, and then you go back up right in their face. And I looked at that, I'm like, oh, that's dirty. I love that.
Bit of a circle here, right? Particularly with a single-handed sword, because you don't have the benefit of the other hand helping out, being able to pull while the main hand pushes, things like that. So you might have to do it this way. And that makes perfect sense because, for example, if you're trying to bait a cut to your leg by leaning forward a little bit and kind of sticking out the leg, not too obviously, but if they then go for it, you do a leg void, step back, and then circle the sword around and then cut. That gets the sword out of the way too.
Yeah.
Because you could just as well use that if they try to beat the sword aside.
Right,
and
which
they
is
go for
the
a beat,
thing.
you remove the sword and counter like that. So
I mean, absolutely, and that's a technique you can favor. I think that there's some people that might be able to capitalize on that. I think, and I would love Skallagrim's point on this because he brings a lot of good points to the table. How does that go against 2-point? How does that go against dual wielding, right? Specifically of dual wielding with similar length implements, or at least similar enough, right? Like one could be, an inch or two longer, but it's similar enough dual 2-point, right? Where if you try to void and you try to swing around, how do you personally combat, them trying to come on in, and they're going to do that kind of like switching motion, if you will. So if they have, and it's hard, like I might have to actually open up Microsoft Paint. So if you have your swords, let's say they're both parallel, right? And then you raise this one, so like it's here, and this one's still kind of here. And you step on in, and this right one, where Skallagrim's expelling down to his left, and he's coming over here. Where if you bring this one and you kind of rotate it, and then this one that's already rotated comes vertical again, so you're kind of like switching over, right, so to speak. You're switching the angle of both of them in a single step forward. So that could hypothetically block that blade, and then a second blade is ready to go into your gut. How do you specifically do that against 2-point? Because I think I think it's a good tactic. I absolutely do. I think that there's styles that might be weak against spear, for instance, as well. SCA, rapier. We do have spears. We have access to spears. We use, I think it's the cold steel, very, very, very light polypropylene ones, the ones that bend. Something like that. I don't necessarily think that would work too well against, but I would absolutely be interested to hear if that does work against spear, because spear is very, very quick with the jabs it can do.
why would that matter for choreography if your main goal is not to represent historical martial arts as accurately as possible?
It's flashy.
Well, it could be a way of showing why one character is more skilled than the other. Showing rather than telling. If you have two characters in a sword fight, the one has larger movements and just keeps swinging around, and the other is very precise.
No.
Even if it might be harder for the audience to see, not necessarily depending on how you're doing and how you're framing and everything. Either way, the audience will get a feel for, okay, this character is more competent, precise, confident, maybe even, while the other is just relying more on brute force.
I mean, let's think about something as simple as Naruto, right? You have sometimes these wide arcing attacks, right? But then you get someone like Madara Uchiha when he shows up to, body the Shinobi Alliance, right? And sure, he has his grandiose movements. Sure, he'll have his Katan Gokai Mikaki, right? His giant fire wall that he just will spit out, and then he can use it to hide in, right? Yes, but when you get into the hand-to-hand, right, notice how many shinobi are, they're trying to jab at him, and they're trying to slice at him, and they're trying to land blows on him, and he is dancing circles around them and in them, right? And obviously this is coupled with his Sharingan, which showcases his power, but it also showcases his skill and finesse as the legendary Uchiha Madara Uchiha, right? something that you can very easily, most everyone who probably has seen, you can look into and you can say, oh, he's got a lot of refinements. He is on a different level versus Naruto and Sasuke. I mean, in the Final Valley, right, you have some of these actions where when they're starting their counter, right, you know, they're fit, they're having some good taijutsu exchanges, they're pretty tight, you know, they land some good blows on each other, and then Naruto ends up getting pushed back, Sasuke ends up warping on over and Chidoriing him and just sends him into the lake below, right? Where something like that showcases a level of finesse, but you know, in comparison to Madara, you know, lacks a little bit more finesse, I could see an argument. And it is a show not tell.
Right, and that's what makes the cut, no pun intended. And I'd say we've seen this kind of thing before in a very different context with different weapons. John Wick is an example. At least the first one. I still haven't watched anything beyond the first.
I haven't watched any of them.
But I definitely remember scenes where he did exactly this. More economical, more compact movements, much faster as a result. So you can just see that this is a guy with a lot of experience. That's how you know how much of an efficient killing machine this character is, and that also makes it more believable that he can take on all these dudes. I mean, it's still not super believable, but the way it's done, you can buy it. You know, at least with suspension of disbelief, it seems appropriate. Right. Whereas if the hero moves sluggishly and slowly and is surrounded by a bunch of enemies who don't really do anything and just kind of politely wait their turn, it's not that fun. It makes it all seem a bit silly, to me at least. Let me know what you think. Hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching, and take care, folks.
No, I like this. This was great. I had a lot of fun with this video. Thank you, Skallagrim. I think the show not tell is appropriate. This is a bop. This is an absolute bop. No, I think he's on point with the show not tell. And I mean, you know, I'm sure I encourage, if you have a similar thing that you have experienced or have seen in media, anime, movies, etc., about keeping it tight and how that showcases finesse, mastery, expertise, right? You know, definitely feel free to share that in the comment section below. I do think that this was very on point, so to speak, no pun intended. And yes, absolutely. So different things have to be adapted for media that is consumed by your average person. And what I mean by that is Lord of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Why could Tom Bombadil and the Barrow Downs not work in the film? And at that point, you have to consider, I mean, like, oh, there's a number of things, pacing. Absolutely, your average theater goer, I feel, you know, can have issues going through concerning hobbits, or, you know, maybe if you're not a huge fantasy or sci-fi and you're just looking for the, you know, oh, I want to see the military tactics going into like Helm's Deep and party tactics going into, you know, Khazad-dûm, right? You know, number of reasons why you could be watching. And honestly, if you have never seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy and you have no interest in fantasy, look at it just from a history perspective, right? Tolkien notoriously dislikes allegory. What I can say is that there is a lot of his own experience buried in the writing, which also comes through in the movies. And so you look at things like, okay, why is the Shire set up the way it is? And you can look back to, oh, okay, you know, pre-World War I, very rural Europe, right? I mean, you could make that connection. You could make the connection of Saruman and industrialization coming into the Scouring of the Shire, which doesn't happen in the movie, but it happens in the books, or at the end of Return of the King, one of the endings where, you know, Merry, Sam, Frodo, Pippin, they're just, you know, sitting and they're drinking some ale, and they can't quite have the same enjoyment they used to in The Green Dragon. PTSD from the war, right? A number of things that you can pick up on, and I would absolutely recommend you definitely go watch that trilogy if you haven't. But there's certain things that have to be adapted from a book or even reality into screenplay. And, you know, getting into the Tom Bombadil and, you know, I almost said Sandbrog. There's my Lord of the Rings Online coming out. Barrow Downs. Yes, that does open up plot hole in the movie on, you know, well, in the books it was a blade of Cardolan that was made with a chance to fight the Witch King. And, you know, now it's just a blade that Aragorn gave them, which you could technically headcanon as a Cardolan blade. But your average person doesn't necessarily care about that. They like the interaction of, you know, oh, well, this hobbit, Merry, just stabs the Witch King in the ankle, momentarily lapsing the Witch King's focus on Éowyn, and Éowyn goes in for the kill, being she is no man, right? And your average theater goer, I think, is going to look at that and be like, oh, this makes sense. Let's look at the adaptation from The Witch King versus Gandalf, one of the most epic fights that we never actually got, right? In the book, you get Grond breaking through the gates of Minas Tirith, and in the book, it's about how the Witch King is the first enemy in how, I think it was 1,000 or so years, something like that. It was a very long time. Someone's going to have to correct me on that. And he walks in through this gate on his black horse, and he's the first enemy to enter this. And Gandalf and Shadowfax are the only ones that are able to stand up to him, and they kind of just posture at each other. And then obviously the chicken crows, and then you have the Rohirrim come on in. Versus in the film, you have a completely different adaptation where Denethor succumbing to his madness. Denethor got character assassinated hard in the movies, by the way. If you read the book, Denethor is a completely different character, in my opinion. And, so Gandalf is having to take Pippin up to Minas Tirith, and then he ends up seeing the Witch King and the Fell Beast, and the Witch King ends up breaking his staff, and it seems like the Witch King has the foothold there, right? Has the power in that engagement, and then you hear the Horn of the Rohirrim, and then goes into the epic scene, and he flies on off to deal with the Rohirrim, to deal with this new force coming in. They're completely different and have to be adapted for a different audience, so to speak. And certain things adapt well in movies and than books. Certain things adapt better in anime than manga, and certain things adapt in real life better than it would in anime, right? What if you had an anime where people are just really quickly cavazzioning and shit, but it doesn't actually explain how they do it, right? Imagine if you're maybe something like My Hero or Naruto, where suddenly they do this a quick twist to their punch, right? And they land the target, but they never actually go into a freeze frame or a slow down of why that happened, how they got there, right? What they were thinking. And it was just a quick sidestep, twist your punch and get them, right? Which works in reality, absolutely. So I think this is a very good video, and I think that it does provoke a lot of thought on the subject. I think it promotes a lot of discussion, and I definitely encourage you, absolutely, if you have discussions on this you want to have in the comments section, if you know anyone, SCA, HEMA, Belagarth, etc., who you think would enjoy this video, definitely, one, go check out Skallagrim if you haven't. Excellent creator. Two, send them the original, and if you want some weird nerd talking for 36 minutes on the subject, definitely send them this as well, because I'm very curious what other people's discussions and thoughts on this are. But definitely go check out Skallagrim, and I will see you all in the next one.